Okay, Boker Tov. So we're continuing the Gemara Masechet Beitzat Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. So we saw yesterday, if we look, we're about halfway down, a little bit past halfway on the Amud. We saw this din right, relating to cooking and preparing from one day of Yom Tov to the next. Right, it said Tanu Rabbanan, Ein ofin mi Yom Tov lechavero. We may not bake, and what's implied is that we may not bake, we may not cook, we may not do anything to prepare from one day of Yom Tov to the next. Now it's interesting. Why is it that we cannot prepare from one day of Yom Tov to the next? The answer is because, as we discussed yesterday with the Eruv, because really one of the days of Yom Tov is meant to be Chol, right? We have Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galiot, which was born out of a safek, out of a doubt as to which day was, and you certainly cannot prepare from Yom Tov to Chol. So if the first day is Yom Tov, the second day is meant to be Chol. So therefore, you cannot prepare from the first day until the second day. Now, we regard both days as Yom Tov nowadays. That's true. We regard both days as Yom Tov nowadays. But nonetheless, the Takana was established based on, with the parameters of the way that it was originally. And originally it was a Safek. Same applies for Rosh Hashanah. Even though for Rosh Hashanah, we have a concept that the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, okay, Yom Arichta Dami, we regard it as one long day. And we saw that right at the beginning of the Masechet regarding Beit Sash and all that. So we regard it as a Yom Arichta lehachmir, but we don't regard it as Yom Arichta lehakel, which means that we are not lenient. So from one day of Rosh Hashanah to the next, we still cannot prepare. We still, in that regard, we have to view it as 2 separate days. So we said, person is cooking, woman is cooking, she only needs one piece of meat. Nonetheless, she can fill up the entire pot, cook the whole thing. You can fill up a whole barrel of water, a whole urn, right? Even though you only need one cup, whatever it is. Right, but when it comes to baking, for example, you can only bake that which you need. Says Rashi, the reason why, what's the difference? He says, you're doing it with one action when you're filling up the pot. So too, when you're filling up the water. But when it comes to baking, each and every loaf or each and every roll, whatever you bake, I don't really bake, but every item needs its own baking and then kneading, etc. And therefore, you're putting in the extra effort, you're doing something else which you don't need for the day, that would be forbidden. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer, ממלא שהכל התנור פת, מפני שהפת נאפת יפה בזמן שהתנור מלא. Okay, so we have to see if this is still the reality. But it was in those days that the way it works, when the oven is, it says when the oven is full, so everything inside bakes better. In other words, if you're going to fill up the oven with a few different loaves of bread, then even though you only need one of them, so that's ultimately, it's all for the purpose of that one loaf, because by filling up the oven and putting the other things in, it's going to make it cook better. So if you have a pot and you really only need the one piece of meat, but you're going to put in all the other pieces of meat and it's going to give it more flavoring and it's going to make it cook better, so then you're not cooking for the purpose of that extra which you don't want. It's all for the purpose of that which you want on Yom Tov, and that would be permitted. That is what Rabbi Shimon is telling us here. So have a look. Let's just look at the Shulchan Aruch, because again, these are very practical halachot. Said very relevant, particularly this year in the next week. So let's have a look at the Shulchan Aruch on what we've just seen. Where do I share the screen? Here it is. Okay, so this is the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Taf Kuf Gimel, which is in Echot Yom Tov. Again, the title of the Siman is Shelo La'achin MiYom Tov L'Chavero, that we may not prepare from Yom Tov to the next day. For example, it's brought down in the Poskim as well. What about when you have, okay, in Israel it's not so relevant, but in Chutz La'aretz, when you have, for example, Shmini Atzeret and then Simchat Torah, And are you allowed to roll the Sefer Torah from one day to the next? I remember one year it was somewhere in Chutz La'aretz, and it was at the afternoon of Shmini Atzeret. So somebody wanted to move all the benches in the shul, move it around so that there would be space for dancing and Simchat Torah. And I remember the rabbi said it's completely forbidden. You can't do that. You're preparing for the next day. So again, here, as we know, it's all one day. But so it says the Shulchan Aruch, right? It's forbidden to bake or cook or do shchita from one day of Yom Tov for the next. Afilu Shabbat or Yom Tov. So this applies whether it's one day of Yom Tov to the next day of Yom Tov, or whether this is more relevant for us, from Shabbat to Yom Tov. Obviously on Shabbat you can't do any of these malachot anyway. And even on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Aval, but a woman who's cooking a pot of meat can fill up the whole pot, even though you just need one piece. Says the Rama, okay, nowadays we don't really do shchita on Yom Tov, but in theory he says you could do, even though you only need a small piece of meat, you can check the whole animal because you can't check half the animal, right? Okay, you don't have to limit yourself to one pot. You can be cooking a number of pots and you want to eat a little bit from each one, that's okay. V'dafka kodem achila. All of this is before the meal. When you've already had your Yom Tov meal, so you can't then in the afternoon start cooking and say, you know what, I'm just going to cook, I'm going to eat a kazait. No. That, he says, to have a harama. That is harama. That's you're trying to exploit a sort of a legal loophole. That is not allowed. Okay, this connects us to the next sugya we'll see in the Gemara. But it says if b'diavad you did cook right for the next day, you weren't meant to. B'diavad you can eat the food. You don't have to go and throw the food away. The next if he says the other case, you can fill up the whole urn of water, even though you only need a bit. But pay attention, says the Rama. You need to fill it up, the whole thing up first, and then you can put it on the fire. But you've already filled it up half, and you put it on the fire. Now you come along, and now you add some more water. No, that is not allowed. That is tircha shelo letzorech. Okay, so I just want to read with you one Mishnah Berurah over here, because this whole question of harama comes up. We mentioned this yesterday. Again, the basic principle, what we've seen, is that we cannot cook from one day to the next. We can cook for that day whatever I need, and if I only need a little bit today, then I can cook the whole pot. So as we've just seen in the Shulchan Aruch, we can't do harama. So you can't, let's say, after lunch, Rosh Hashanah afternoon, you've had your whole meal. It's half an hour. In half an hour, you're going to go to shul, and you're like, you know what? I'm just going to fill up this entire pot. Take a bite so that I can don't have to wait tonight for my supper. That is harama. We mentioned the case if you genuinely need, the kids are going to eat supper, and that's genuinely their meal, and you heat up the soup, so that is fine. That's something else. So it says here, I think it's in Zion, the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah, as follows. He says, Im einot tzarich lesudat hayom klal ve'ikar. Einot tzarich lesudat hayom klal. Let's say this food you don't need for your Yom Tov meal today at all. And your only purpose in cooking it is for the next night. And you eat a little bit in order that it won't be forbidden. So that's the question. That's the case. Yesh dot ben poskim. This is a machloket amongst the poskim. Yesh oslin. There are those who say that is forbidden, that is harama. V'yesh matilin, kevan shakol panim ochel k'tzat mimena. V'gamu kodem achila. There are those who say it's allowed because you're eating a little bit of it and it's before the meal. So again, this is different to the case in the Shulchan Aruch. The case in the Shulchan Aruch was, if I now put my pot on the fire after the meal, so everybody knows that's harama. There is no question. Like I said, if the kids are eating supper, so then it's still considered before the meal. But if I put in the afternoon, I put the pot on the fire after the meal, and I say, I'll just have a bite out of it, and I can heat up the whole thing. No. The question is, let's say in the morning, right, before you've had your meal, so you're cooking all the food you need for lunch, and at the same time, it's cooking the food for lunch. You want to cook the pot that you're going to have for supper, and you're just going to eat a little bit of that so that you to make it mutar. So there are those who say that's harama, and there are those who say that that is allowed. Now he says, says the Mishnah Berurah that I see that the practice is people are lenient. That this is what people do. They cook in the morning, they cook even the food they'll need for the night, and they eat a little bit of it. He says, if this is the practice, this is what people do, we aren't going to protest. But המחמיר כדעה ראשונה שלא לבשל לצורך הלילה בקדרה בפני עצמה, אלא באותה קדרה עצמה שמבשל לצורך סעודת שחלית, but somebody who's מחמיר, and follows the first opinion, you don't put an extra pot on the stove for the night, but you can add in a bit of food in the pot that you're eating from anyway, so that ומעבה בה לצורך הלילה, so then תבוא עליו ברכה. That is the appropriate way to do it. Again, this picture which he makes here at the end is relevant to us because we're probably not cooking most of the time. Yeah, does somebody have a question?
The only thing is I always learned that if you had orchim coming, or you might possibly expect orchim, you can cook more.
Well, that's the basis of Eruv Tavshilin.
No, I'm talking about the Shabbos on Yom Tov on the first day.
That's
when there's the second day as well.
That's from that's yeah. So that's from Yom Tov to Shabbos. That's not from the first day of Yom Tov to the second day of Yom Tov. There when we're talking about from Yom Tov to Shabbat. So we've said that we have an Eruv Tavshilin. Now, an Eruv Tavshilin is what allows us to cook midrabanan. This is machlok between Rabbi and Rav Chisda in the Gram Psachim, and I think we saw it here as well. But essentially, the question was, what you're saying, Jeffrey, is an answer to the question of why there's no Isur D'Oraita. In other words, when I say we have 2 days of Yom Tov, to cook, to prepare from first day of Yom Tov to the second day of Yom Tov is an Isur D'Oraita. Why? Because the second day might actually be a Yom Chol. As we've explained, when relate what is a Yom Chol, right? What is a Chol, but it might be. So to prepare from Yom Tov to Chol, you cannot do. Okay. To cook from Yom Tov to Shabbat, so we would say that on a D'Oraita level, it should be okay. And why is that? Part of the reason is we say the Gemara says because there might be a situation where you have, as you say, guests can walk in unannounced at any moment. In some places it's more common than others, but they could come, and then you would have to add extra food for them, and therefore you are on a D'Oraita level. You're allowed to cook still in Yom Tov because it might theoretically still be needed for Yom Tov. Rabbanan came along and said, "Wait, if you want to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbos, that's not enough. We won't rely on that by itself. You need to have the Eruv Tavshilin also." Okay, but I mean, for a person now, but that's when you're cooking. That's when you're cooking for the day itself, or for Shabbat. For a person on Yom Tov afternoon to just say, "I'm just going to cook because maybe guests will come," and guests aren't really going to come. You're not expecting it. That is not allowed. Okay. So now the Gemara says, as far as Ibayelahu, we are maybe 15 lines up from the bottom. Ibayelahu. Okay, we're now going back to the dinim of Eruv Tavshilin, and we're asking the following question. What happens, but you have a number of cases where a person forgot to make the Eruv Tavshilin. So now what do we do? We're a little bit stuck. So it says, Ibayelu Mishalo Aniach Eruv Tavshilin. The question is, somebody who did not make an Eruv Tavshilin, do we say, Hu Nesar, V'kimcho Nesar, or Dilma Hu Nesar, V'en Kimcho Nesar? In other words, the person who did not make an Eruv Tavshilin is now not allowed to cook. Do we say that he's not allowed to cook, but also that, meaning, is it a prohibition on the individual, or is it a prohibition on the food? Do I say you can't cook, and also your kemach, your flour, the food that's in your house, cannot be used? Or do I say, no, you can't cook because you don't have the Eruv, but the food that's in your house, somebody else could come along and cook with it? Right, that's the question. What is the nafkamina, says the Gemara. What's the practical ramification of this? Meaning, would you have to, if you want others to come and cook for you, would you have to make a kinyan of your flour? Would you have to give it to them so that they can cook? If If you say he's forbidden and his flour is forbidden as well, so then the only way somebody can come and cook for you is if they purchase or they acquire your food and it becomes theirs, and then they can cook because they have their eruv tavshilin. But if you say, no, it's just the person who's not allowed to cook, but nothing intrinsically happens to their food, so then then you would not have to acquire your food to somebody else in order for them to come and cook for you. So the Gemara brings a proof. So it says,
is there an issue of making a kinyan, of transferring on Yontif?
Well, generally speaking, on Shabbat we would say no. It would be an isur d'Rabbanan at the most, and if it's for the sake of ochel nefesh, so then it would seem to be okay. So we say here's the proof. So it says, "My tashma, mi shelo aniach eruvei tavshilin, arei ze lo yafeh v'lo yivashav v'lo yatmin, lo v'lo lacherem." Somebody who did not make an eruv tavshilin cannot bake, cannot cook, cannot insulate. Right? These are different methods of preparing food, different methods of heating food up. We'll see a bit later on what the significance is of mentioning them all separately. So he can't do it for himself. He can't do it for others. And others can't come and cook or bake for him either. So what does he do? He has to give his flour over to somebody else. And then they can bake for him, and then they can cook for him. So Shema Mina, that is the proof. That's conclusive that not only is he forbidden, but also his flour, so to speak, becomes forbidden, his food, and you have to give it to somebody else. Right? Rashi says, yeah, laknuye kimcho. Rashi near the bottom, it says, Im tzarich latet b'matana et kimcho. He has to give it as a gift. Obviously, you can't purchase it on Yom Tov, but he has to give it to somebody else. That they can come and bake, and they can then give it to him. Okay, now the Gemara asks another question, and this is going to take us up for most of the following Amud, trying to bring proofs back and forth to answer this question. We'll see if we succeed, but it's going to take us a while. So we are 4 lines from the bottom of the Amud. The last word on the line is Ibaye. Ibaye lahu. We have another question. The question is as follows: Aval v'afa. Oy vavoy. So the person, not only did they not make an eruv tavshilin, but they then went and baked or they cooked on Yom Tov for Shabbos without having an eruv tavshilin. That is forbidden. You can't do that, right? But the question is, they did it. Avar v'afa. So b'di avad, what are we going to say? Is the food permitted for consumption? So avar v'afa mai. Okay, what do we say? So now, avar v'afa mai says Rashi Aviyah ma'u she'ochal b'Shabbat. Are you allowed to eat it on Shabbat? Right? Presumably, we understand that even if we say you can't eat it on Shabbat, if you wait afterwards, maybe we know the dinim of Maseh Shabbat and Maseh Yom Tov, depends if it's shogeg or mezid or bichdei she'asu, etc. But the question is, again, a person did not have an eruv tavshilin, they then went and transgressed and cooked on Yom Tov for Shabbat. Are you now allowed to come on Shabbat and eat the food? So we will bring a number of different attempted proofs. Proof number 1, Tashma. Somebody who doesn't have an eruv tavshilin, what should they do? Okay, so this is what it says. It says somebody who does not have an eruv tavshilin, they should give their flour as a gift to somebody else, and then the other person can come and cook and bake for them. Okay, so what's the proof from there? The proof is as follows over the Amud. It says, if it was true, if what was true? If it was true that b'di'eved I cooked, I could then go and eat it, so litnei avar v'afa mutar. Right? In other words, the question is, what does a person do? What does a person do when they don't have an eruv tavshilin? So here the Braita says, you don't have an eruv tavshilin. What you have to do is you have to find somebody else who can cook for you. Why doesn't the Braita say, well, if you don't have an eruv tavshilin, but if you ended up cooking, you can still eat the food? That would seem to be easier than going and finding somebody else to take your ingredients from you. So it says, meaning, And that seems to be the proof that it's not mutar. That's asur. So Amar of Ada bar Matna, Tana takanta de teraktani, takanta de isura loktani. Says Rav Ada bar Matna, this is not a proof. Because if I'm teaching you what to do in a certain situation, even though it's b'diavad, I'm going to teach you the tikkun. I'm going to teach you how you're going to be able to eat. I'm going to give you a solution that is mutar, that you're allowed to do. I'm not going to give you a solution that is okay b'diavad, but where you actually transgressed, right? Why would you expect a writer to say, if a person doesn't have an eruv tavshilin, so then what should they do? Then they should transgress again, and then b'diavad they can eat the food. That's ridiculous. You're not going to say that. You say what they can do. If it's happened, b'diavad they forgot, they didn't know, they weren't sure, they cooked without the eruv, and then they can eat. Okay, fine, then they can eat. But that is not a proof to say that they can or that they can't, right? That's what he means when he says, Tana takanta de teraktani, takanta de isura, loktani. So let's just see Rashi on that. Rashi at the top of Amud Bet says, I ita da avar v'afa mutar. Michtei tana atakanta kama hader. Right. So if it was true that you could go and you could bake, and it would be that if you had gone and baked, that it would be you'd be allowed to eat it. So michtei tana atakanta kama. And now when the Tana is coming and teaching what to do. So nitnei nami achtakanta. It should also teach us this possibility. And the Magnea Kimcho. So Rashi over there is maybe answering an implicit question, which is we wouldn't expect that, certainly even in the Havamina, we wouldn't expect the Tana to come along and say, if you went and you didn't have an eruv tavshilin, so then the solution is that you go and that you go and cook, which you can't do, and then you can eat b'diavad. No, that doesn't make sense. Rashi is saying the question is, it should have said, if a person didn't have an eruv tavshilin, so then they need somebody else to go and take their food, and then they can cook for them. And if they cooked b'diavad, then they're allowed to eat it. Okay, that would have been more reasonable to say. That is what Rashi is suggesting. But nonetheless, the answer was Tana takanta de tera. He only wants to tell us those things which are permitted, not those things which are forbidden. Okay, so that is the first attempt at proof, which falls away. Let's see the second one. Tashma. On the third line on Amud Bet. Tashma. Mi she'eniach eruvei tavshilin, harei ze ofer muvashel umatmin. V'im ratza le'achol et eruvo, haloshut beyado. Somebody who, okay, so this now is talking about a case of somebody who did make an eruv tavshilin, and the person made an eruv tavshilin. Harei ze ofer muvashel umatmin. You can bake, you can cook, you can insulate your food, keep it warm. Okay. If you wanted to eat the eruv, what do you mean if you wanted to eat the eruv? We always eat the eruv, right? When do we eat the eruv? We eat it on Shabbos. On Shabbos, when it's already served its purpose on Yom Tov to allow me to cook, and that's fine. What happens if I eat the eruv on Yom Tov? Remember, the whole point of the eruv is that it's there and it's present at the time when I prepare. So at the time that I prepare on Yom Tov for Shabbat, I still need my eruv to be intact. So what if the person came and on Yom Tov ate the eruv? Okay. Im ratzah lechot eruvo, harshut biyado. Okay, it's not an issur. You want to eat the eruv on Yom Tov, you're allowed to. However, achalo ad shelo afa, ad shelo etmin, ad shelo bishal, ad shelo etmin, harei ze lo yofer v'lo yivashel v'lo yetmin. However, if you ate the eruv before you had engaged in whatever preparation for Shabbos you wanted to, if you ate the eruv before you had cooked, before you had baked, before you had done hatmanah, so now you want to do the hatmanah and it's on Yom Tov, but you've already eaten the eruv. Well, you can't do that. It's as if you don't have an eruv. You don't have an eruv, right? So it says, "Achalo ad shelo afa ad shelo etmin, harei ze lo yafeh lo yivashav lo yatmin, lo v'lo lacherim v'lo lacherim ofinu v'vashlim lo." Right? But you can't do it for others, and others can't do it for you. Aval, but what can you do? Aval mevashelu le Yom Tov. You can cook. It's still Yom Tov. So you can still cook for Yom Tov that you need. And if you have left over, so you have left over for Shabbat. Okay, b'vad shelo yarim. Don't say, I'm cooking for Yom Tov, right? But you're actually cooking for Shabbat. No, you're cooking for Yom Tov and you have left over. You can have what's left over. V'im yarim asur. Right? If you did b'harama, that would be forbidden. So what is the proof from here, right? the proof from here is that by the end, where we say Imerim Asur, we said you can cook for Yom Tov, and if you have left over for Shabbat, you can eat it on Shabbat. But you cannot melekatchila cook on Yom Tov in such a way that is harama, that you're actually cooking for Shabbat. And if you do that, Imerim, that is asur, that is forbidden. So what do you see from here? That b'di'eved, you went and you cooked on Yom Tov for Shabbat in a forbidden way. You're not allowed to eat the food. You're not allowed to eat the food. That's the case. So says the Gemara, says Rav Ashi, Hangan. That's not necessarily the same. Amar Rav Ashi, Haramaka Marta. Yeah, remember, in our case was somebody forgot to do an Eruv or chose not to do an Eruv, whatever, and then they just cooked because they forgot, because they didn't know, or because whatever. Yeah, you're doing harama. You're sort of trying to exploit the legal loophole. You know exactly what you're doing, and you're doing it anyway. So there, Rav Ashi says, but when it comes to harama, harama come out. Shani alama da'achmilu bal Rabbanan tfeimi mezid. Rabbanan were stringent when it comes to ha'arama, even more than when it comes to mezid. In order to prevent you from doing this, because people can very, very easily come along and say, with mezid, everybody knows. Yeah, with arama, everybody can say, I was just doing it. I thought it was mutar, etc. We just have to mention, harama is a very, very interesting concept. Rabbi Daniel Feldman from YU has a whole book that came out about a year ago, I think, about examining different cases of harama in halakha. Not every case is exactly the same, and we'd have to examine where was it that Rabbanan were more machmir and less machmir, etc. One of the places, for example, lots of familiar cases, I'm sure you all know. One of the cases where the discussion about harama comes up at length is when it comes to mechirat chametz, for example, right? Mechirat chametz, which nowadays is very, very widespread, and everybody does it. Even if you don't have chametz, and even if you don't have chametz you want to sell, you still go and you sell your chametz, right? It's on all the to-do lists of what you have to do before Pesach. But it wasn't always that way. And when it was instituted, so there were different phases, and historically it's very interesting to track. But there were those who were very opposed at certain stages to mechirat chametz. There are those that are still opposed to it today. And there's a famous tshuva of the Bechor Shor, who says that the only reason that mechirat chametz could work is because on a doraita level you can do bittul. On a doraita level you can do bittul, and therefore there is no isur doraita. It's only an isur dorabanan. Because he says, because it's harama, and harama would only work on a dorabanan and not on a doraita. Okay, others disagree, and again, there's more to talk. Like I say, every case of harama, I think, has to be examined in and of itself, because they are not always necessarily similar. But that is what we see. That is what we see over here. Okay, so that was the second proof. So we still are left with an open question. Our open question is: Avava Fabiyam. If a person came and without having an eruv went and cooked or baked on Yom Tov, are they allowed to now go and consume the food on Shabbat? And the answer at this point is we don't know. We tried two proofs. Neither of them was conclusive. We saw a way to reject each one. And so the Gemara will continue with more, but I think we'll stop there for today. Ad Kan. Have a wonderful day. Shabbat Shalom. Shana Tova.
Thank you.
What happens if the Rav of the community, of our Kehillah, let's say, makes an Eruv Tafshilin that basically is to motzi the entire congregation?
Yes. So we saw that already. We discussed that in the Gemara. I thought you were going to ask me what happens if the Rav of the Kehillah forgets to do his Eruv Tafshilin. The answer is he should not forget. But these things happen. But we saw before the case with Shmuel, which is that the Rav has everybody in mind, but a person cannot rely on that like it's Gilad. Meaning, if a person forgot, so then they can come and then they can rely on it. But if the question is if they forget once, twice, three times, etc., then they're called a posher. You cannot lechatchila go and choose to forget, right? And in order to rely on it, then it becomes more problematic.
Right.
Yeah, if anyone is available for mincha today at 6:20 at the Rifkins, they're a little short. That would be greatly appreciated.